Hey there, welcome back to the Impact Driven Leader podcast. This is your host, Tyler Dickerhoof. Man, I'm excited to be here with you. We are kicking off season 3 of the Impact Driven Leader. The amount of growth, the amount of development that everyone within the community has seen is just outstanding. I just a couple of days ago had a conversation with one of the roundtable members, and just to see where that individual has grown over the 2 years that they've been in the roundtable is awing, is inspiring, is exciting. And I want to just share that there's a time for you to join right now for the month of January here as we're starting in 2023. It's kind of the onboarding month. There's going to be a workshop on January 9th and 10th. I invite you to come. Just check out a little bit about the community. I'm going to share some of the lessons that I've learned over the years now of leading this podcast, but as well growing. And it's growth by action, and it's growth by doing, it's growth by being around other people. And man, I'd love to have you as a part of the community. There are going to be some changes, and I hope they're exciting for you here in 2023. We're actually going to kick off the Impact Driven Leader Roundtable in the month of February, but as a special bonus here in January, as part of the Impact Driven Leader Book Club, I get to introduce this book, Becoming a Changemaker, written by Alex Budak. Alex and I have a tremendous conversation, and I'm excited for you to hear this conversation. I'm not going to belabor. I'm not going to go too long. As you can see, the book back there too. I am in a new office. There's a little bit of new artwork for this year, this season in the podcast. I'm excited to share that. But here's what I'm excited about. Learning to grow. Yes, I said that right. Learning to grow is a mindset. Becoming a change maker is a mindset. If we adopt the mindset to grow, to impact, to be a change maker, man, our world is a better place. I'm excited for you to listen to this, whether you're watching on YouTube, whether you're listening, wherever you're listening to podcasts, hit subscribe, share a little message. What value have you gotten out of this? And as well, I hope to see you on January 9th and 10th at the Awaken the Leader Within workshop. You can find out more information by going to theimpactdrivenleader.com, as well my website, tylerdickerhoof.com. You can check out all sorts of things there. If you want to learn more about myself, the Impact Driven Leader community, check out 4 Days to Maximum Impact. You can check that out as well on either one of those websites. You can enter right into that stuff. So thanks for being here. Can't wait to catch up with you at the end of this episode. Alex, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast, man.
Oh, Tyler, thank you for having me. Thrilled to be here.
Yeah, so excited to get to know you. Excited to read your book, Becoming a Changemaker. I know we have several mutual connections. Liz Wiseman, who you mentioned, who has written a little acknowledgement for your book. And I was excited to dig into it. And, as I went through it, I'm going to say this, I get to interview a lot of authors. That's kind of my focus, and leaders too. And as I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about all this great content, I kind of have to say, Alec, it's really 3 books in one. It really sets it up for, there's a part, you talk about the change maker mindset, which we'll get into, change maker leadership, which is a big part of it, and then change maker action. Obviously, all 3 of those add up to the impact equation that you have put together. But man, I really see it as 3 great books in one.
Well, I appreciate that. No, thanks. Yeah, that's a nice way to think about it, I think.
So bring us, the whole audience, and again, this is a leadership podcast, kind of bring everyone to the point where you're like, man, this idea of making a change and this perspective of being able to make a change, how did that first really strike you?
Well, as I think back on my career, I consider myself a social entrepreneur. So I co-founded a social venture called Start Some Good, and, had all the ups and downs, the roller coaster of that. And that came, I guess, very naturally to me. As I look back, I think I'm a pretty mediocre entrepreneur, as it turns out, but I gravitated towards that, towards sort of making change through the lens of entrepreneurship. And then as life sort of happens, I fell in love with a woman. She got a job offer in Stockholm, Sweden, and moved out with her. And while I was there, I had the great privilege, really, to lead an incubator for social entrepreneurs, social innovators throughout Scandinavia. And so as I sort of shifted from being an entrepreneur myself to sort of supporting entrepreneurs, I came in there ready to, roll up my sleeves and let's talk revenue models. Let's talk measuring impact. But I kind of realized pretty quickly that a lot of what I was helping with them on were actually leadership challenges. That it was more about, how do I fire my first employee? How do I think about, bringing on my first person that's going to support me and be my co-founder in this? All these interesting leadership challenges. And that's where I realized that it's not enough to just have a vision for change, not enough to just be able to measure your impact. That so much of it comes down to, can you actually lead people towards change? And that's where I started shifting a bit from the entrepreneur Alex to the kind of leadership and teacher Alex.
To me, it's this classic that, coming from education, coming from a background, you think, okay, if I learn all these technical skills, if I have all these technical abilities, it's the classic, if I build it, they will come. And as I've learned, as you just shared, it's like, no, it doesn't work like that. If you don't build something that people are enthralled with, either as a customer or as someone building it, no one cares.
Yeah, and let me build on that and say that it's not enough to just build it. You've got to find ways that you build it with others. That we tend to think about the lone innovator, the lone entrepreneur, and put them up on a pedestal. But if you're going to have any type of scalable change, you're going to have to do it through and with others. And so how quickly and how effectively can you engage others in the change? And that makes all the difference.
So, I alluded to it here in the as I was opening up between the Changemaker mindset, leadership, action. And, you identify, and I would rightly agree, that mindset is probably the biggest start. If you have, equal quotient, I think it's probably, there's magnifiers there. But I think what really separates people from being able to make a change or not is their mindset and their willingness to grow that.
Yeah, that's right. That's why I start my class at UC Berkeley with mindset. I start the book with mindset. And I think that's what the way we can start unlocking all of our potential to lead change is with changing the way we see the world and our role and our ability to shape it.
So where do you see, and I kind of posed this question to you, and I think it's a point now, is, I would readily agree, you identify in your book, other people have identified that, man, we're in a real leadership deficit. And, I would say, and you kind of allude to this, I think, is it's not that we don't have positions of leadership. We have a deficit of people that know how to lead and are actively leading from I would call it a healthy point of leadership. What do you see as this big hindrance that we're dealing with in the world in regard to leadership?
A lot of us get put into these leadership positions where we haven't honestly thought a lot about the type of leader that we want to be. If you think about traditional tech companies where you often get promoted based on your ability to code, and then suddenly you find yourself managing a team of 7 people and you look around and go, but I don't actually know how to lead this team. And I think you're exactly right that we do see a lot of bad leadership in the world. My first job at UC Berkeley was running a leadership center for them. And so in this job, I got the great privilege to reach out to all these people, leaders who inspired me, and they would actually take my call. If it were just me, they wouldn't have taken it, but because I could say on behalf of the center, they would say, yeah, sure, let's meet. I'd take them out to coffee, and then I'd ask them questions about their leadership. And I would ask them, how did you develop your own leadership style? And what was so fascinating to me, I could not have predicted this, was that the number one answer, probably 70% or so of people said the way they developed their view of leadership, their own style, was they had experienced a bad leader and they decided to do the opposite. That they had experienced a leader who was arrogant or entitled. And they said, okay, in that moment, when I get to lead someone, I'm going to do the opposite of that. Now, on one hand, it's really inspiring that these people made the conscious decision, that they experienced that bad leadership. And they said, no, I'm going to do something different. But also, how many people are going around experiencing this bad leadership that doesn't bring the best out of ourselves and our teams?
Well, I think as you say that, and I think that's one of the great, it's either model of what's great, model what's bad. Those are two classic teaching ways. As you share that, and I think about it, it's like, how many people aren't in a position, though, to recognize the difference between good leadership and bad leadership? Meaning, if that's the only model of leadership they've ever seen, maybe they think, well, I just didn't have a good team, or I didn't have a good product, or it wasn't the right time. They make all these other excuses, and it's like, no, your leader was not a good leader. They were, they didn't create psychological safety, which you talk about, which I think is the number one issue facing organizations in our society today. And So if they don't know what good leadership is, and they're in this position where they're like, well, I'm just working for this leader and I don't know any different, I'm just going to put in my time and get out. How do we disrupt that cart?
Yeah, such an important question, because it's so easy to just assume, well, yeah, maybe we're just meant to be leaving work every day at 5 o'clock drained. Like, that's all I know. And that's just how it's supposed to be. So I think it begins with a bit of self-awareness. That's where books like this or others can hopefully be helpful to remind you that there is another way possible, that what we've experienced, that there are ways we can question the status quo, and that when you feel something, you feel like, well, it doesn't seem quite right, rather than just ignoring it or saying, oh, well, that's just the status quo, that's just how things are, that we start building, you know, what you said, that mindset to say that things can be a little bit different and I can do something about it.
Yeah.
You know, I'm inspired by the words of poet Amanda Gorman. She delivered the poem at the inauguration of Biden and Harris. The Hill We Climb is her poem. And the final 3 lines, she says, are, for there's always light if we're brave enough to see it and we're brave enough to be it. And I love that way of thinking about a changemaker mindset, for there's always light, that tomorrow can always be better than today. If only we're brave enough to see it, if only we can sort of see things that others may not see yet, status quos that can be questioned or systems that can be changed. But then that third part, this idea of brave enough to be it, that it takes courage. It takes courage to sort of stand up against that status quo and say, not only can this be different, but you know what, I can do something to make sure that it is different. And that's a nice way, I think, of considering the changemaker mindset.
So, I mean, to dip back so we don't leave it too quick, this idea of what's hindering, you know, leadership from being better. Do you think it's the mindset? Do you think it's the makeup? Do you think it is, you know, if I look at, you know, again, you shared that you asked, you know, all these different leaders, and they said 70% of them were like, I wanted to do better because the example I had was just, But I wonder, you know, where our society is today. Nonprofits and, you know, corporations are going to be, you know, their leadership ability is going to be leveled because of profitability. Either the nonprofit not having funding or the corporation not having funding. If we look at this big piece of not just the United States, if we look around the world in this idea of leadership in government, and it's kind of like, that doesn't play out there, because we see these two poles where every country that's involved in democracy, we continue to see these poles, right, that are pulling each other apart. And so not to pick one or the other, it's just like, what's causing this to be more divisive and not healthier in a form of leadership?
Well, I think one of the key things we have to look at is we move more and more and more towards a short-term focus rather than long-term. You know, Simon Sinek talks about playing the infinite game. And I think so many of us, we should be playing that long-term game, but we get pulled into that short-term. You know, we think about, you know, I'll be a better leader, but let me just first hit my Q1 numbers. I'll be a better leader, but let me just first get 7 more people hired onto my team. We keep putting it off and off and off. Yeah. You know, I like the words of the author Matthew Kelly in his book, The Long View. He says, we tend to overestimate what we can do in a day, underestimate what we can do in a month, overestimate what we can do in a year, and underestimate what we can do in a decade. And so I think we as individuals, as teams, as a culture, as a collective, we need to zoom out a little bit and stop thinking quite as short term and bring on that longer term view. And whether that's thinking about things like the looming climate catastrophe ahead of us, or just running companies that can sustain for the long term, not just thrive for 3 months or 6 months, 1 or 2 quarters, but can be in it for the next decade. We need more of that long term thinking.
Well, and I think that's a perspective that, you know, if we're weighing decisions on that, right? If we're able to take away our ego, meaning what am I going to get out of that? How am I going to be viewed by this instant decision to say, no, all right, I may have to lose the battle today to be able to gain the battle over the next year, 2, 3, 5 years in order to win that, you know, decade, win those battles later. And it takes a lot of clarity, self-awareness. You know, again, that's in families, that's in organizations, that's in corporations. And I really believe if I had a way to kind of wave that magic wand, it'd be helping people, you know, like you mentioned, Simon Sinek, to say, hey, don't play this finite game in an infinite world where, yes, the finite's important, but not at the expense of the infinite. And we've seemed to get, you know, a lot of different organizations get caught in that. That's where I believe during, you know, COVID, during the pandemic, a lot of leaders made really, really bad decisions because they were told, hey, you can't use this as an excuse. So you need to do whatever to stay profitable or, pull a rabbit out of a hat instead of saying, you know what, just do what's best for the people today. And if we do that, everything will work out. And they weren't allowed that.
Completely agree. Yeah, if you start thinking about not just how do we survive, this bump, and there will be more bumps to come for sure, but how do we stay strong for the long haul, for the next 10 years? And yet maybe there's a little dip in our revenue, a little dip in our profitability for a bit. But if we're holding on to our people and we're creating the environment where these people don't just manage to stick around, they desperately want to stay with us for the next decade. Yeah. Well, that's going to be a buy-in. That's going to mean that 8 years from now, the rewards will really pay off. It's not easy necessarily in the short term. But when you can zoom out a little bit and see those long-term gains, hugely, hugely beneficial.
And I think that's where, as we sit and grant here with the end of 2022, and we're able to kind of prospectively look back over the last 2+ years, we do see those situations where those leaders that, utilized a lot of the tactics that you talk about in the book to create psychological safety, to make sure that, they were looking out for, the best interest of those that they led, that have actually risen, and the companies and organizations and that were kind of like, hey, we're going to just burn through this the best we can, and we're going to burn people. We just got to do whatever to stay alive, instead of saying, well, let's make sure that we're taking care of people first. Man, it's amazing how divergent those have become. And it's really, kind of separated, even so much where I think people are like, what's going to happen in the economy? Because I'm not sure, because there's these over here doing great and these over here are doing worse and worse. What is it really? Because I'm not sure. So I don't know if you have a take on that or what your thoughts along those lines are.
So, I'm not sure on when it comes to the economy, I'm not sure I have too much to say there.
No, but I mean, in regard to why companies have thrived and why others haven't, again, it's to me, I point to the organizations that are like, man, we took care of people. We made sure that if you need to work remote, if you need childcare, we'll help you. And what's interesting is not all those companies, but some of those companies have seen where hey, we haven't had a lot of turnover. Now we've become more profitable. Now we've actually learned leadership tactics and, protocols that are making us better. Whereas other organizations where if you're not in the office come, 5 days a week, come this certain date, where there's a lot of tension, where there's a lot of lack of sociological, psychological safety, where those companies are continuing to kind of go through this churn. I mean, you read about the reports that whether it's a great resignation and this great changeover, and yet it's not one fits all, even though all of us went through the same pandemic.
Completely agree. So I was working with an executive team for a big mortgage insurance company, a national mortgage insurance company. And they were coming to me trying to figure out, okay, how do we think about our culture of change making? Kind of how do we keep people on board, and how do we navigate, the digital disruption and transformation and all of that? This is kind of middle of COVID. And my whole point was, let's take care of your team first. If they need to work remotely, make sure they can work remotely. If we need to be flexible, I think we finally understood, how hard it is to be a parent, among other things, during this when you're lacking constant childcare. And there's some pushback sort of saying yeah, okay, but we need to have a policy. We need to have people should be back in the office 3 days a week. And I was sort of saying okay, but why? Why is it 3 days is the magical amount? Or 2 days.
Yeah.
Let's focus on them as individuals. Let's take care of them, and then let's policies emerge from there once we get our feet underneath us a little bit. But trust your people, trust the team, and then once you get them to be at their best, then a lot of good things can happen. Yeah.
So taking from that, I think when you, and I read this recently, and I forget where it was. One of the influences I have, either Peter Drucker or Robert Greene or Maxwell or someone, it's maybe he was in Tony Dungy. He was again, I just read off a litany there, but it's this idea that if you focus on the character and values, usually the consequences and punishments are far less than when you have all these rigid and you just expect people to follow the rules and know that they're, those rules are meant to be broken, right? And first break all the rules and this idea. But if we focus on the character we have as employees, hey, what's important? What are our actual values? And not just what's thrown up on the wall. What do we live and act and breathe by? I think, again, those leaders that followed that, protocol system, man, they've found even greater performance. They've, seen better rewards. They've seen, now all of a sudden it's like, hey, we used to have a staffed office that, we needed a larger office. Now we can scale back, and our productivity actually went up because we're more flexible. Well, that gives us greater opportunity to do things in the future that we never thought of. Man, we just got better as an organization.
Yeah, you mentioned Tony Dungy, so let me mention one of my favorite coaches. Behind me, I've got John Wooden's Pyramid of Success. Of course, I'm a proud UCLA Bruin, so of course I've got to have that as part of my UCLA backdrop. But what I love about his Pyramid of Success is that nowhere on there is anything about winning basketball games. It's not about score. It's not about defense. It's about building people of character. It's about having a vision for, like, what does it look like to not just be a great team, but a great teammate? How do you support those around you? Mm-hmm. Wooden was so focused not on wins and losses. He wasn't focused on, do we win this game? He was focused on doing your very best and practicing really hard. So that way, when the game comes, you do your very best. He says, success is the peace of mind of knowing you did the best of which you are capable. That there's so much that comes down to luck. You don't know what the other team will be like on a given night, all these variables. All you can control is doing your best. And that comes from these certain characteristics that he put forward in his pyramid of success. Yeah. But that's a model that each of us as leaders can come up with. What are the characteristics, the mindset, the things we want our team to have? And you focus on that, then a number of those sort of quantifiable measures, the profit loss, the revenue, those things will follow.
Yeah. Well, and I think you outline that in really this, the Changemaker, again, equation between the mindset, the leadership, the action. Is like, be curious, be courageous, as you mentioned, and be willing to say, why does it have to be that way? And I think one of the great, as an Enneagram 8, as a challenger, as someone that likes to push and like, hey, you give me a box, I want to think about all the ways outside of it. One of the cautions there, and I'd love to know how you teach this to your students or talk to people about it, is how do you say, there's some things that need to change and others we need to keep the same? So how do you balance that?
Well, I'm Enneagram 7 with a little bit of 8 in it, so I can kind of see where you're coming from here. But yeah, when we talk about it, like, look, part of the place I start is I teach at Berkeley, where a lot of people want to question the status quo. But one of the things I remind them is that if you question the status quo on literally everything, not only will you not be effective, you'll probably also be kind of annoying after a while. And so a bit of it is, you could say, like, picking your battles. But if we think about it in social psychology terms, there's work done by Edwin Hollander. He comes up with something called idiosyncrasy credits. And idiosyncrasy credits are the ability to diverge from group norms, to kind of go your own way, to question the status quo. And he says you can earn these through 2 ways. The first is through simply doing good work, right? If you show up your first day of work and you're like, okay, here's my computer, here's my desk, now here's the 7 things we're going to change. People probably won't be bought in because they need to know, first of all, that you can do good work. And the second thing is going along with group norms on some things. That way, if you go along on things that you don't care quite so much about, that way when you do diverge, people will know that you're serious about that, you really do care. So imagine that you're trying to plan a banquet event and there's 100 things you could change, but maybe you focus on the 2 you care most about, making sure that the food is sustainable and that there's a hybrid option for people to attend. Those 2 big things, instead of fighting, should we get a different caterer or a different seating chart, let some changes go so that way you can make sure you take action on the ones that are most essential to leading change.
I think that's probably one of the greatest differentiators in leaders, is the ones that can, really analyze, create that, flow chart. Like, all right, what changes need to be changed and what changes, don't fit right now. There's a piece in the book that you mentioned, cognitive flexibility. And this idea as a leader, my opportunity is to take multiple different views, maybe that completely are opposite than my own, and hold them in within the group or myself or whatever, create out of that the best path forward. I think that's a recipe for healthy change and, healthy impact. It's like, it doesn't have to be exactly the way I see it, because if I accept that I have blind spots, I'm not going to see it.
So important. So that's building on the work of Zuccaro at George Mason University, a psychologist who spent his career trying to study how do leaders adapt to change, and yet cognitive flexibility. And what I find in working with all kinds of leaders is that they often go on one of 2 poles. So either they fall in love with their own ideas, right? So they go, I've got the idea. I'm the smartest. I'm the leader. I've got this idea. That's the plan we're taking. Or they sort of go, I think we should do this. And someone goes, no, I don't think so. He goes, oh yeah, you're right. No, we shouldn't do my idea. You're completely right. They give up on their ideas too quickly. And what we actually want is cognitive flexibility, which is where you can hold multiple mental models at the same time. Hold 2, 3, 4, 5 different paths. Consider all of them. It's your own. It's those of others. It's not giving up on your own, not giving up on others. Hold on to them, explore them, twist them around. Maybe you think it's path 5, but then you hold it long enough. It's actually path 6 is the right one. And it's not easy to do, especially in this short-term view where we want to just take action right away. But I try to encourage my students especially to sit with problems a little bit longer than they would like. There's a quotation that's often attributed to Albert Einstein, although it's not actually clear if he said it, but regardless, it's a great quote. It says that if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about a solution. We want to jump into action right away. And, as change makers, we do need to have a sense of urgency. But I think in general, most of us would do better to sit with a problem a little bit longer to make sure we understand it from each of its different angles, understand the nuance, understand the root causes, the underpinnings, the systems lens before we take action. That way we make sure we're actually solving the right problem.
I think about that, and that's happened recently is, we get into this point of like, and I've had people say, it's like, oh, I'm sick about talking about the problem. I just want to talk about the solutions. We just need to talk about the solutions. And my viewpoint on some of those situations is like, but have we really identified the problem? Are we just talking about the symptoms? We could walk into the hospital, we're, bleeding, and all of a sudden somebody throws a Band-Aid at us and we bandage it. But it's like, well, is that where the blood's coming from? Is that where the damage is? And it's like, no, you actually need to do triage like they do in hospitals and understand where's it actually coming from. And I think so often as leaders, and we mentioned the leaders that are judged based upon what are you doing today? They're constantly, well, this solution and this solution and this solution. It's like, we're just throwing Band-Aids on it. We're actually not fixing the problem, and it will continue to fester because to that point, I don't think, there's almost this idea that we go into it in change with the answers before we ever hear the problem. And instead of saying, what is the problem? Like, let's really deep down and let's drill down and to say, is that the problem or is that just another symptom of the potential problem? And I think that idea to disengage your ego or your, security from the solution to say, oh, maybe I'm the problem. Well, how could I engage differently, or how could I utilize my resources lead differently to get a better result? I think comes back to that very early comment that you made, those leaders that said, I saw bad leadership, so I wanted it differently.
Yeah, this builds on a few themes that we've had so far in our conversation, but I love this idea of thinking about systems. So imagine that you are blindfolded and you're trying to figure out what's this thing next to me, and you're feeling it. And by the way, for those of you listening, it's an elephant, but you're feeling it, you're standing by its leg and you're sort of feeling, oh, this is a brick wall that I'm standing next to. Then someone else is standing by the tail and it's feeling the tail and going, oh, this is a brush. Right? So we all have blind spots, as you mentioned, and we're trying to solve a problem, especially a deep systemic problem. We all won't know exactly what's going on unless we really try to understand the problem. And imagine trying to take action on this thing if you think you're trying to address a brick wall or a brush. Very different. And so you've got to bring others into the solutions with you, right? As a leader, are you leveraging the viewpoints of a diverse team around you? And then on top of that, are you taking the time to really understand the problem? Or are you just going, okay, I've got it. Let's go. Let's take action. Sitting with that problem, understanding it from each angle can be really important.
There's something I've, again, you've talked about it in your book. There's another book I recently read where it talked about this idea of compromise and cooperation. And as I think about that, is that story of the elephant. It's like, if we cooperate and we put those together and add onto it, we can maybe come up with it's an elephant. But if we're constantly looking for compromise, we're going to find a brick handle brush, right? We're not willing to accept it. It's like, it isn't that. And yet often I think in our, again, relationships, in our work relationships, in our leadership relationship, we go to compromise, or we go to accepting that, we'll have agree to disagree, instead of cooperative looking and saying, hey, what does work out here? Where can this change come from if we cooperate, instead of thinking, well, it has to be my change or your change, and try to compromise the two of them? It's like, well, how can we make both changes happen, which is going to benefit everyone? And I think you talk about that some and building this idea of influence and doing it in a systematic kind of, 5-part way.
Yeah, that's right. So I teach at a business school where I think we often teach influence in a way that can feel a little bit sort of sleazy or transactional. You might know something like the reciprocity effect. It's like, Tyler, I do something nice for you, and then you feel compelled that you have to do something nice for me. And that can work, again, in like a one-off game. But if we're believing in playing the long term and really trying to change like systemic issues, we've got to think about how you can influence sustainably and for the long term. And to that end, I've come up with what I call my 5 influence superpowers. These are 5 ways of influencing for the long term that actively engages and brings others into the change with you. So going through the 5, first we have empathy. And so it's being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes. Patty Sanchez wrote in Harvard Business Review, finding that about 50% of C-suite executives, when they lead change, they don't actually take into account how that change will be perceived by people on the front lines. So it's not enough to just be right. You've got to understand, well, how will this person be thinking about this change? Are they scared of change? Do they just take this new job? Are they scared of getting fired? How are they going to be thinking about this change when it comes to them? So empathy. Secondly, relationships. This is the epitome of a long-term play because relationships aren't overnight. But I think about a buddy of mine who recently asked me if I would support him. He was running a race to raise money for a rare disease that affected a loved one. And I said, yes, in a second. Of course, I was happy to. But when it came down to why I supported him, it was honestly much more about our relationship than it was about that specific disease. Not that it wasn't important. It just is not one that has affected my family, but I cared deeply about him and wanted to support him. So relationships. Thirdly, vision. So painting a picture of the future that's so compelling that people can't help but want to be part of it with you. And I think crucial here is connecting individual parts to the whole. If you're trying to get someone to come on board and help you with a change initiative and they're, let's say, an accountant, can you help them understand how their work on the numbers will help you affect this larger change that you're leading, connecting the small to the big? Fourthly, passion. Now, here's where I think authenticity matters because you can't fake passion. But if you're truly passionate about something, about leading this change, about this vision that you're bringing out into the world, lean into it, leverage that. People want to feel a sense of purpose, feel something bigger than themselves. And then the 5th and final one is safety. Not everyone will be a ready change maker, and some people will be quite afraid of change. So at Berkeley, which is a big bureaucracy, of course, I've learned how to try to influence others that might be reticent of change. And so I'll say something like, hey, look, I get that coming along with me on this is a big risk, right? So using some empathy. And I'll say, but here's my promise. If it works out, I promise that you will get the praise. And if it doesn't work out, I promise I will take the blame. That's a small way of making it safe for others to be part of the change with you and to influence them sustainably and for the long term.
It's interesting because this word empathy to me is probably a word that has changed me as much as a leader. Again, we dig back into this, bring it back this box of, the leaders that changed because of the poor leadership they saw. For me, it was the desire to change because I saw the results of my, bad leadership. And one, I guess, action, if I really would put an action that I've tried to employ and do differently is be more empathetic. And, as we talk about this word and as I'm sitting here and I'm listening and I'm thinking about how I view empathy. And my definition of empathy is putting your arms around someone and walking with them. And my retort to that is it's really hard to put yourself in their shoes if they're in them too. And I think as a leader, sometimes to me, that's very realistic. Like I can't put myself in your shoes if we're going to both be here. And as you were talking about that, and I was thinking about this idea of influence as a response to empathy, is if we put our arms around each other and walk with each other, right? And I'm thinking about this from a leadership perspective, and I'm trying to help other leaders. My ability to see maybe, a hole in the ground. And I'm saying, hey, Alex, let's go a little bit to the right so we don't walk in that hole, that vision and whatever it may be. That also, that arm around you, that psychological safety that as we navigate this pothole, that actually we're safer in that. And we have that relationship. We're building that relationship. And there's excitement that we're on this journey together. And then I think when you also add in this idea of how can we do so that is, again, taking all those elements, but we're going to the same place. Man, to me, that's just empathy living out. And what ends up happening by that, it is influential. And you can't come in with the ego, the insecurities, all those other barriers we've talked about. Or, one that I like to include here is this, the lack of inclusion, the lack of sensitivity to other people. You put your arm around somebody, you're walking with them, those things quickly go out the window. As I'm even saying this, I'm thinking back of where, they used to do this when we were kids. I don't know if it happened to you. It might have happened to me. I saw it. Is like if you got in a fight with somebody in like kindergarten or preschool, they made you hold their hand and walk around with them. And, so you had to build that tangible relationship. I really think about that again, as you share and giving clarity that idea, how empathy is the solution in every case, but yet it's so misunderstood.
And I like that metaphor you used about sort of intertwining our work, our life with someone else, and much different when you say, hey, look out for that puddle versus like, we're both about to head in this puddle together, so let's steer around it.
Yeah.
One of the mistakes that I made of many as a leader, so first-time leader of Start Some Good, the social enterprise I co-founded, and I was, the scrappy entrepreneur. I was working, 90-hour weeks, not proud of it. I was working a ton, and I'd be sending emails at 2 a.m., 3 a.m., right? I'd just be working really hard. And then I realized that our interns would be sending me emails after midnight as well. And it was like a gut punch. I was like, why are you doing this? I never told you to do that. I felt so badly. We were paying them, but not very well. And I never wanted them to be sending emails at midnight. Leave the work at 5. That's fine. What I realized is that I never told them to send me emails after midnight, but I never told them not to. And so they were observing my behavior. And from their perspective, it was totally rational. I said, well, he hasn't told me not to, so I guess that's what's expected. And that's when I realized that your organization is going to have a culture, whether you define it or not. And so it's crucial you get up ahead of it and you start defining it. I never, ever expected them to be working past 5 p.m., but I never told them that. I never put myself in their shoes of thinking, well, hey, I want to impress the boss, and he's sending emails after midnight. That's probably important. And wow, that was a hard lesson to learn, but one that I learned and have applied forward in every organization since.
So I appreciate you saying that, and I wanted to circle back to that. When you said you were a mediocre entrepreneur, unpack that. I just want to know more. Why would you say that you are? What have you identified that made you that, where you're better suited what you're doing now?
Yeah, I think there's some aspect of like when you do something, and not that it comes easily to you, it comes naturally to you. It's sort of what you're meant to be doing. And as I look back, I've had many different hats. I've been an entrepreneur, an intrapreneur, I've been an executive, and I've also been a teacher. And I find that when I teach, I'm in an absolute state of flow. I'll teach a 2 or 3 hour class, and it feels like it goes by in 10 minutes. And I'm seeing things that others don't see, and things just come together. And that's where I realized, I'm really meant to be a teacher. When I was an entrepreneur, I would talk with other entrepreneurs, and I would be so impressed with, they would see things that maybe I wouldn't quite see, or they would just have sort of a mindset for entrepreneurship I didn't quite have. It didn't mean that I was a bad entrepreneur, right? I got something off the ground, I began it. But I think it just didn't come quite as naturally to me as it did to others. It's not to say you don't kind of persevere through the downs, because there are plenty of downs. And I kept going, and I kept iterating, kept being resilient. But I think I realized that my skill set was more naturally towards being a teacher. To be clear, an entrepreneurial teacher, but more towards a teacher than an entrepreneur.
Yeah, which I love, because I think there's a lot of times, and you made this comment where people are like, oh, I have to be, I'm self-made. I did this on my own. I got it off the ground. I bootstrapped this whole thing. Those are so rare that they're really not true, because you said there's so many other people involved. But I also appreciate what you're saying is, I think you found your absolute niche and what you're good at and your purpose. But I believe, as probably you understand too, hey, there's a role for that in entrepreneurship, because sometimes it is being that, that teaching, that person that is so willing to work with all the staff. And maybe there's a partner who's that extreme visionary and sees the things that you don't see, that complements you. We mentioned a little bit Enneagram. I'm an 8. You said you're a 7 wing 8. My wife is a 7. And, it's times we work really, really well together because those, complement each other. Other times it's just straight sparks. It is, like fire, because it's, and as a friend said, iron sharpens iron. When iron sharpens iron, there's going to be sparks. It's going to happen. And I think as this leader, and we talk about change in being willing to accept those differences and knowing from those differences, but if you hold the same values and character, man, that's where great things happen.
Totally agree. And that's something, a perspective I didn't quite have my first time, which is where I thought entrepreneurs have to do everything. We've got everything together and we've got to kind of both do all these things. Yeah. But if I were to start again, I would think, and this is what I advise my students as they think about their change-making teams, is, think about who complements you. What are some of your blind spots? One of our blind spots was that we were both very entrepreneurial. And so we hired a ton of people who are entrepreneurial. Now, there's a lot of positives to that. But then when it came time to create, spreadsheets and do operations, we kind of looked around and go, none of us can do this. None of us know what to do. And so making sure that you have that self-awareness. What are you good at? But also be honest. What are things that you're not so good at? And building around that, because there are people that have that talent, and make sure you complement each other.
Yeah. I think that's a big facet of just, coming back to the self-awareness and the ability to be a leader, to be a change maker, as you have it described. It's, what are you doing to gain self-awareness? I'd love to know what you do in your classes with your students to help them start to develop that skill of self-awareness.
So one of my favorite things is to build a personal advisory board. So build a group of people whom you trust, who have different experiences, different perspectives from you. I built that for myself. And here's just one small example I never would have otherwise known. So, Tyler, we've talked about this already. You and I are both big sports fans. And I tend to like to make sports analogies, right? So he hit it out of the park. She, punted it, whatever. But someone helped me realize that that's actually not very inclusive language if you're working with someone who isn't a sports fan, or someone maybe not from the US, and I'm giving all these baseball analogies, right? They don't get that. And so that was one small thing that someone told me. And I was like, you're absolutely right. I use a lot of sports analogies. It comes naturally to me. I'm happy to watch ESPN, but not everyone does. And so let me think about how I can use language that's a little bit more inclusive. I probably would not have come up with that on my own, because most of my buddies are sports fans. We all talk sports.
Yeah.
When you realize, no, that's actually something that's maybe holding your own leadership back. What a gift to get to know that.
Yeah. Well, and I think the safety for someone to say that, say, hey, okay, explain to me a little bit more, because I don't get that. But then I also think there is this element to say, hey, the best way to engage with people is being native to them and communicating with them. And so I would say is like, I like to use a lot of different analogies, as we already have here, but I think the ability there is to say, those are worthwhile. How can I find different ones and understand the people I'm with? So maybe you do have someone that is a cricket fan. And so you learn a little bit about cricket. You try to explain it that way, or maybe they're not into that at all. Maybe they're into art, maybe they're into music, whatever. And finding those different ways to communicate, to me, is a massive way to grow as a leader, as you're talking about, and be inclusive, but not stop being who you are.
Absolutely. And it allows you to think about not that your worldview is the correct worldview, but to actually adjust yours to those of others. And then as a result, what a great benefit. I learned a little about cricket, make the cricket analogy, and then I can then use that going forward. It's a win-win.
Totally. Well, I thank you for our time together here, Alex. I appreciate it. And, really this book, The Changemaker, Becoming a Changemaker, And, man, I love how it is, again, 3 books in one. It really kind of walks through this equation that you've laid out, the mindset to the action, to the leadership, action multiplier, and that's how you get impact. And I appreciate it. I appreciate the time to chat with you and have this conversation, and keep doing your work. Can't wait for more work for you to be bringing forward and sharing with us.
Oh, Tyler, thank you so much for having me. I guess if I write another book, I'll come join you, but maybe that's book 4, 5, or 6 if you think this is already in one. So
let's
4, 5, or 6 coming up.
All right. Awesome.
Thanks, Tyler.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation I had with Alex. I loved it. It was really, as I'm going through, it's like, man, this book, Becoming a Changemaker, not only did I enjoy it when I read it, but as well the conversation I had with Alex, I knew it had to be a part of the Impact Driven Leader book club. And what better to have it as the book to kick off 2023. Go get your copy right now. Maybe join the community where we go through the book. I give you more of an in-depth conversation. I'll share kind of my deep dive into the book as part of the book club as well. You'll get a daily prompt question. If you haven't been a part of the book club, or maybe that's something interesting, get more out of the book by being part of the community where you can learn just a little bit deeper. One piece that I want to take away from this conversation that I had with Alex, it's this idea of mindset plus leadership times action is Changemaker impact. I really believe that could be part of the impact-driven leader equation. It is the mindset. Hey, I can grow, I can develop, I can become a better leader matching that with healthy leadership. What does that look like? How do you lead in a healthy way? And then getting into action, being willing to do it, being willing to engage and lead people and learn with them, for them. And that's all part of the impact-driven leader philosophy that I love to share within the roundtable, within the impact-driven leader community. Again, last and foremost, thanks for being here. Thanks for making season 3 a bigger success than season 2, season 1. The amount of growth each of those 2 years had was just awing. And I'm thankful you're here. And I'd love for you to do this. If you got value from today, share it with someone. Share it with someone else so they can get value from either this book or this conversation. I'm looking forward to way more conversations. I can see if you've watched many of these episodes in the past, this is a new office, a new background. You're going to see it change and evolve. It's a little messy right now. I just moved in yesterday. But I'm excited to grow this year as my office changes and grows. I'm excited to grow with you as well. And I'm excited to have you on the journey. Thanks for being here. Till next time, have a good one.